Just before midnight, a man in a worn jacket walked into the lobby of a grand old hotel, with a small girl who was not his daughter walking close at his side, a child of about 7, who had wandered in out of the cold an hour earlier, lost and hungry, and looking for her mother, and the night manager took one look at the pair of them and decided, before either of them had said a single word, that neither one belonged inside his building. He did not see a man helping a frightened lost child. He saw a shabby stranger and a problem, and he moved to remove them both. He told the man the hotel was full. He told him there was none for people like him here, and when the man quietly asked that someone at least help the little girl find her mother, that someone call the police, that someone bring her something warm to eat while they sorted it out, the night manager called security instead, and 2 large men crossed the marble floor to walk a tired man and a lost child toward the door, in front of a lobby full of well-dressed guests who watched and said nothing. What the night manager did not know, what no one working that desk knew, was that the shabby man in the worn jacket owned the building. He owned the marble under their feet and the chandeliers over their heads and the uniforms on their backs. His name was on the whole company that signed their paychecks, even if his face had never once appeared in a company newsletter, because he was a private man who had spent a great deal of his life being looked at the way they were looking at him right now, and had built this place, in part, so that it would never look at anyone that way. His name was Keanu Reeves, and before the night was over, one man was going to lose everything. A frightened child was going to find her mother, and a hotel that had forgotten what it was built for was going to be reminded, in front of 50 witnesses, by the quietest person in the room. But to understand the night, you have to understand why a man who could sleep anywhere chose to walk into this particular lobby at midnight in a coat with a frayed cuff. And you have to understand the boy he used to be, long before there was a holding company or a single key to his name. Keanu Reeves had not planned to stop here. He had been away for the better part of 3 months, a long stretch of work in another country, and he had come back into the city late, on a flight that landed 2 hours behind schedule, and by the time he had his bag, he was tired in the specific way that makes a soft bed feel less like a luxury and more like a medical necessity. His own place was another 40 minutes out. Across a city he no longer had the energy to drive, and somewhere on the road into downtown it occurred to him that he was passing within a few blocks of the Carrington, the oldest and grandest property he owned, a historic hotel in the heart of Chicago that he had bought when it was failing and restored over many years into something he was quietly proud of. He had a standing arrangement that he could have a room there any time he wanted, though he almost never used it. He had not called ahead. He rarely did. There was a reason for that, and the reason was the whole reason any of this happened. Keanu Reeves had a habit, an old and deliberate one, of walking into his own buildings without warning, dressed exactly as he was dressed now, in plain clothes that announced nothing, carrying nothing that suggested money, so that he could see what a place was actually like when no one in it knew the owner was watching. It was the only honest way to learn the truth about a hotel. He had decided long ago, because a hotel on its best behavior tells nothing, and a hotel that thinks no one important is looking tells you everything. He did not think of it as a test. He thought of it as listening. And the thing he listened for more than anything else was how a place treated the people it believed did not matter. Because he had learned, the hard way, a long time ago, that this and not the marble or the chandeliers was the true measure of any house. He had learned it as a young man in a hotel not unlike this one, where he had worked the overnight shift, carrying other people's luggage for tips that never came. Before there was any money, before there was any of this, Keanu Reeves had been a night porter. One of the invisible people who keep a grand building running in the hours when the guests are asleep, and he knew from the inside exactly what it felt like to stand in a beautiful lobby in a uniform and be looked through as though he were a coat rack with a pulse. He remembered the particular cold of it, and not the cold of the weather. There was a specific temperature to being treated as furniture, a chill that had nothing to do with the thermostat, and he had felt it most on the nights when the lobby was at its most beautiful, because the more golden and warm a room was made to look, the sharper the contrast when its warmth was withheld from you on purpose. He remembered carrying a heavy case up to a suite for a man who did not look at him, did not speak to him, did not acknowledge that a human being had crossed a building in the middle of the night to make his arrival easier, and who closed the door without a word, and how Keanu Reeves had stood in the carpeted hush of that hallway for a moment afterward, 19 or 20 years old, and understood with perfect clarity that to a certain kind of person he was not quite real. He had not been angry, exactly. He had been something more useful than angry. He had been awake. He remembered an older porter who had worked beside him in those years, a patient man who had taught him how to carry a heavy trunk without scratching the wall and how to hold his face still when a guest was unkind, and who had told him once, near the end of a long night, that you could judge any establishment in the world by a single question, which was how it behaved toward the person it was certain it could afford to ignore. Not the guests it wanted to impress, the ones it thought were beneath noticing. That sentence had never left Keanu Reeves. It had become, over the decades, less a piece of advice and more a kind of spine, the thing the rest of him was built around. And when he had finally had money, real money, more than a young porter could have imagined, the first serious thing he had done with it was not to buy himself comfort, but to buy a failing hotel and try to make it into the answer to that one sentence. It was, in a real way, the foundation that Carrington was built on, and tonight he was about to watch his own house fail the only test that had ever mattered to him. He pushed through the revolving door into the lobby, and for a moment, before anything went wrong, it was exactly as he had dreamed it. Warm light fell across the old marble. There was the faint sound of a piano from somewhere near the bar. The long front desk of dark wood gleamed under lamps he had chosen himself. The room was designed in every detail to make a tired traveler feel that they had arrived somewhere safe, and Keanu Reeves stood just inside the door and felt, for one breath, the simple satisfaction of a thing built well. And then he saw the child. She was standing near the end of the front desk, very small, in all that grandeur, a girl of about 7 in a thin coat that was not warm enough for the night, her face streaked in the particular way a face gets when a child has been crying for a while and has run out of the energy to keep doing it. She was holding the edge of the desk with both hands, as though it were the only solid thing in a world that had stopped making sense. And she was looking up at the night manager with the desperate, fading hope of someone who has already asked several adults for help and been turned away by all of them. Keanu Reeves had crossed half the lobby before he was aware he had decided to move. He came up gently, a few feet away, and crouched down a little so he was closer to her height, and asked her quietly what was wrong. And the whole story came out in the broken, looping way that frightened children tell things, that she had been at a big crowded place near the station with her mother. And there had been so many people, and she had let go of her mother's hand for just 1 second to look at something, and when she turned around, her mother was gone, and she had walked and walked looking for her, and gotten more and more lost and more cold, and she had seen the warm light of the lobby through the glass and come inside because it looked like the kind of place where someone would help. Her name was Lily. She was hungry. She did not know her mother's phone number. She was trying very hard to be brave and was not quite managing it. She had done, Keanu Reeves realized, exactly the right thing. A lost child is told, by every adult who has ever tried to keep her safe, to find a grown-up in a uniform, to go into the big bright building where the people work, because those are the places that are supposed to help. She had followed the instructions perfectly. She had seen the grandest, warmest, most official-looking room on the street, a place with doorman and a front desk, and people in crisp clothes. And she had understood it the way IELTS taught to us understand it, as a place of safety, a place that would take her in and find her mother. And the cruelty of what was happening, The thing that put a cold weight in Keanu Reeves's chest as he listened to her was that she had walked toward exactly the kind of place that should have helped her and found. Instead, a man whose first instinct was to decide which of the people in front of him deserved to be removed. A hotel has a duty toward a child like Lily that is not complicated and is not optional. You keep her safe. You call the police. You find her guardian. You do not leave her alone, and you do not turn her away. It is one of the few things about running such a building that is genuinely simple. And the Carrington's night manager was, at that very moment, failing to do any of it. Keanu Reeves did the obvious thing, the thing any decent person would do. He straightened up, and he turned to the front desk, and he asked the night manager for help. The night manager's name tag read Roland Whitfield, and he was a man of about 45 in a pressed dark suit that he wore at midnight because he believed, deep in himself, that authority was a thing you maintained through surfaces, through the crease of a trouser, and the shine of a shoe, and the cool distance you kept from anyone who looked like they needed something from you. He had been watching the shabby man cross his lobby toward the child, with an expression of gathering distaste, and he had already, in the private court of his own mind, reached a verdict about what he was seeing. He did not see a stranger stopping to help a lost child. He saw a disheveled man he did not recognize attaching himself to a situation, and the conclusion he drew from that was not generous, and the conclusion shaped everything he did next. There is a thing some people do, a quiet and ugly thing, where they look at a kind act and find a way to make it sinister, because their suspicion of a certain kind of person runs deeper than their ability to recognize decency. Roland Whitfield was doing it now. He looked at Keanu Reeves, at the worn coat, and the late hour and the unshaven face, and he looked at the small girl beside him, and instead of relief that someone had found her, he felt something closer to alarm, and the alarm was not for the child. It was the alarm of a man who has decided that the real problem in front of him is the man, and that the man must be removed. "I'd like some help," Keanu Reeves said. "This little girl is lost. She got separated from her mother near the station. She's cold and she's hungry and she doesn't know her mother's number. We need to call the police, and we should get her something to eat and somewhere warm to sit while we sort this out." Whitfield looked at him for a long moment, and then he said, in a voice pitched carefully so that the guests in the nearby lounge chairs could hear it, "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you what your relationship is to this child." The question hung in the air with a particular ugliness. Keanu Reeves understood it completely, understood everything it was implying and everything it was designed to do, and he kept his voice level and said, "I don't have any relationship to her. I found her standing here a minute ago. That's exactly why I'm asking you to call the police, so they can help her find her mother." Whitfield's face did something small and satisfied, as though the answer had confirmed a thing he had already decided, and he said, "Of course you did," and reached for neither the phone nor the child. What he did instead was come around the desk. And while he was coming around the desk, the door behind Keanu Reeves turned, and a couple walked in out of the night. A man in a soft camel coat and a woman whose coat cost more than most people in that lobby made in a month. And they crossed the floor with the loose, unhurried confidence of people who have never in their lives had to wonder whether a room would be available to them, because in their experience rooms always were. And Trent Dawson at the desk brightened for them automatically. The way a plant turns toward light. "Welcome to the Carrington. Do you have a reservation with us this evening?" They did not. They were walk-ins, exactly as Keanu Reeves was, arriving at the same desk on the same night with the same request, and within a few minutes Trent had found them a room and run a card, and handed across 2 keys with a warmth that filled the whole counter, while 10 feet away a lost child sat hungry, and a man who had asked for nothing but a phone call was being told to leave. No one in that lobby could have missed it. The same desk, the same night, the same 2 people behind it, and 2 completely different answers to the same question. And the only variable that had changed was what the 2 arriving parties looked like. Keanu Reeves watched the whole transaction without a word. He did not need to say anything. The lobby had just been shown, in the plainest possible terms, the exact shape of the thing, and some of the people in it had the grace to look away from the couple, because they had understood it too. "I think," Whitfield said, settling into the smooth and reasonable tone of a man who has found a way to do something cruel while sounding responsible, "that the best thing for everyone here is for you to step away from the young lady and leave the building. We'll take it from here." And Keanu Reeves, who had not moved from Lily's side, said, "Then take it from here. Call the police. I'll wait right here until they come, and until her mother is found. I'm not leaving a 7-year-old alone in a lobby at midnight with a man who won't even make the call." And something flickered across Whitfield's face at that, because it was correct answer. The answer of a person actually thinking about the child. And it did not fit the story he had decided to tell about the shabby stranger. And rather than adjust the story, he doubled down on it. Now let me stop here for a second, because this is the part that matters most. And it is the part that the people in that lobby would argue about later, the ones who saw it. There was a moment, right here, where Roland Whitfield could have simply picked up the phone. A lost child was standing at his desk. The entire weight of his job, the entire purpose of a hotel, every duty of care the law and basic decency placed on him, all of it pointed at one simple action, which was to keep the child safe and call for help. And he did not do it. And the reason he did not do it is the whole sickness of the thing. He did not do it because doing it would have meant treating the shabby man as a person who was right, as a person whose judgment was sound, and Whitfield had already decided that this man was a problem to be removed, and he could not hold both ideas at once. So he chose the story over the child. He chose his verdict over the 7-year-old in the thin coat. And that choice is the thing that 50 people were about to watch Tim answer for. Remember the doorman. You will need him later. Standing at his post near the revolving door, in the long gray coat of the Carringtons' overnight staff, was an older man, easily in his late 60s, with white hair under his cap and the patient stillness of someone who had worked nights his entire life. His name was Solomon Greer, and he had been a doorman at grand hotels in this city for more than 40 years. And when Keanu Reeves had walked through the door a few minutes earlier, Solomon Greer had gone very quiet and very still, because Solomon Greer had recognized him. Not as a celebrity. Solomon did not care about that and never had. He had recognized him as a man he had once worked beside, a long time ago, when they had both been young and carrying other people's bags through the small hours for tips that did not come, in a hotel across town that no longer existed. Solomon Greer knew exactly who the shabby man in the worn coat was, and he knew it from a part of his life that had nothing to do with money. And he was watching what Roland Whitfield was doing, with a quiet that was about to become something else. The two of them had been boys together in the way that men who share the worst shifts of their early lives are bound, and they had both been taught by the same old porter, the patient man with the sentence about how you judge a house. Solomon had stayed in the work his whole life, by choice, because he liked the door, liked being the first warmth a traveler met coming in out of a hard night, and he had watched, over 4 decades, a great many establishments fail the old porter's test in a great many ways. He had learned to keep his face still through all of it, the way they had both been taught. But he had never, in 40 years, watched a hotel throw its own owner out the front door for the crime of helping a child. And he had never watched it, not knowing that the shabby man it was abusing was the one human being in the building who had built it on the exact principle it was now betraying. Solomon Greer understood, standing very still by his door, that he was watching something that would be talked about for a long time, and that his own account of it, when the time came, would matter. And so he did the most useful thing a witness can do, which is to watch carefully and remember everything and wait. But not yet. For now, Solomon Greer watched and waited, the way men who have worked nights their whole lives learn to wait. Whitfield, meanwhile, had moved fully into the role he had chosen. He had a young clerk at the desk, a well-groomed man of about 28 named Trent Dawson, and he gave Trent a look that straightened the younger man's spine. And Trent, who had been about to do something decent, who had in fact half reached for the phone himself, withdrew his hand and looked at his screen. Whitfield was building a wall, and he was recruiting, and the lobby was learning, person by person, that the safest thing to do was to look away. Keanu Reeves saw all of it. He saw the doorman go still. He saw the young clerk pull his hand back from the phone. He saw a woman at the concierge desk, whose name tag read Renee Caldwell, stop moving entirely, her hands flat on the counter, her eyes fixed carefully on nothing, the posture of a person who knows that something wrong is happening, and has learned, in this particular building, that naming it is not safe. He saw two guests in the lounge grow quiet and turn their attention toward the desk without committing to it. He had been in rooms like this before, many times, on the other side of this exact silence, and he recognized the shape of it instantly. It was the silence of people who know an injustice when they see one and have each decided, for their own reasons, that it is not their place to be the one who speaks. And he made a decision, the same decision he had made 100 times in his life, which was that he was not going to be loud, and he was not going to announce who he was, because announcing who he was would end the thing too quickly and teach him nothing, and because there was a deeper principle at stake, which was that the child at the desk and the lesson in the room both deserved better than a rich man pulling rank. He was going to let it play out a little further. He was going to see exactly how far Roland Whitfield was willing to go, not for his own satisfaction. Because if this was happening at the Carrington, the property that was supposed to be the soul of everything he had built, then he needed to see the full shape of the rot before he decided what to do about it. So when Whitfield said, again, more firmly, "Sir, I need you to leave the building now," Keanu Reeves did not argue, and he did not reveal himself. He simply said, "I'd like your full name and your title, please, for the record." And the request, so calm and so specific, unsettled Whitfield more than shouting would have, because shouting he could have dismissed, but a quiet man asking for your name for the record is a man who is keeping track, and some animal part of Roland Whitfield registered that and did not like it. He gave his name and his title without warmth, and Keanu Reeves noted them the way he noted everything, quietly, completely, without making a show of it, and then he did the thing that broke the script entirely. He stayed. He took Lily gently by the hand, asked her if she would like to sit down while the grown-ups sorted this out, and walked her not toward the door, but to a pair of armchairs in the center of the lobby, and sat down with her, and asked Trent, across the room, in a perfectly even voice, whether someone could please bring the young lady a glass of milk and something to eat, because she had told him she was hungry, and a hungry child should not be made to wait. And the simple decency of it, performed calmly in the middle of the floor, did something to the room. It made the cruelty visible. As long as Keanu Reeves had been standing at the desk, the situation could be framed as a dispute. The moment he sat a frightened child down in a warm chair and asked for a glass of milk, everyone in that lobby could suddenly see exactly which of the two men at the center of this was behaving like a decent human being, and it was not the one in the suit. He talked to her quietly while they waited, the small talk you make with a scared child to give her something to hold on to, besides her fear, asking her about the bear she did not have with her and the school she went to, and what her mother looked like, so he could tell the police, and he kept his voice light and unhurried, as though the two of them had all the time in the world. And the men in uniforms gathering at the edges of the room were of no particular concern, because he understood that the single most useful thing he could do for Lily in that moment was to be a calm adult who was not afraid, so that she could borrow some of the calm. It was a small kindness, and it was also a kind of defiance, because every quiet, ordinary sentence he spoke to her was a refusal of the story Whitfield was trying to tell, in which Keanu Reeves was a danger and not a shelter. You cannot easily cast a man as a threat to a child while the child is leaning toward him to answer a gentle question about her favorite color. The picture would not hold, and the longer Keanu Reeves sat there being unremarkably kind, the more the picture Whitfield needed fell apart in front of 50 witnesses. Roland Whitfield felt the room turn, and rather than turn with it, he hardened. He crossed to where Keanu Reeves sat with the child and stood over them and said, in a lowered voice, meant to sound discreet while still carrying, that this had gone on long enough, that the Carrington was a private establishment, that he had asked the man to leave and the man had refused, and that he was now going to have him removed. And Keanu Reeves looked up at him, calm the way deep water is calm, and said, "You have a lost child in your lobby, and your plan is to remove the only person who's tried to help her. I want you to hear yourself. Call the police, Mr. Whitfield. Right now." And Whitfield, who could not back down without admitting he had been wrong, who had built his whole sense of himself on never being the kind of man who is wrong about this kind of thing, turned instead toward the far side of the lobby and gave a short nod, and two security guards who had been waiting for exactly that signal began to cross the floor. One of them was a broad, quiet man named Andre Boyd, and as he came, he was already uneasy, because Andre Boyd could see what everyone in that lobby could see, which was a tired man sitting with a scared little girl and a glass of milk that had just arrived on a small tray, and nothing about that looked like a threat, and the order he had been given did not fit the thing in front of his eyes. He slowed without quite meaning to. He would remember that later the way his own feet had hesitated, and he would be glad of it. Andre Boyd had been doing hotel security for 9 years, and he had removed people from lobbies before. People who were drunk, people who were aggressive, people who were genuinely frightening other guests. And he knew the feeling of a justified removal in his body, a kind of squared-up certainty. He did not have that feeling now. What he had now was the opposite of it, a wrongness that started in his stomach and traveled down in the feet that would not quite carry him the last few steps. Because the training that told him to follow a manager's instruction was running directly into something simpler and older that told him you do not loom over a man for the crime of comforting a lost child. He stopped a few feet short. He told himself it was to assess the situation. It was not. It was his conscience applying the brakes, and somewhere in him he knew it. And the knowing was the first crack in Roland Whitfield's whole structure, because a manager who gives an unjust order depends absolutely on the people below him carrying it out without that crack. And the crack had just appeared in the form of one large man's hesitating feet. It was at this moment that Lily, who had been watching all of it over the rim of her glass, with the frank attention of a child who has not yet learned to pretend she does not see what she sees, set the milk down on the little tray and looked up at Roland Whitfield and asked him a question. "Why are you being mean to the man who helped me?" Her voice was clear and unhurried, the way a child's voice carries in a quiet room, and it went further than she intended, reaching the guests in the lounge and the couple by the elevator, and Renee at the concierge desk, and the two guards who had stopped a few feet short. There was no accusation in it. It was a pure and sincere question, the kind a child asks when the behavior of the adults around her simply does not add up. And sincere questions asked clearly in quiet rooms have a way of landing harder than any argument. Whitfield did not answer her. He could not. He looked at Keanu Reeves instead, which was its own kind of answer. And Lily, working through it with the patient seriousness of a 7-year-old who takes the world's rules at face value, asked the second question, the one that truly emptied the room of air. "He gave me his coat because I was cold, and he asked you to find my mom. Isn't that what you're supposed to do here?" She was right, of course. At some point in the preceding minutes, without any fuss, Keanu Reeves had taken off his worn jacket and put it around the child's shoulders, because she was shivering, and no one had remarked on it, and now a 7-year-old had pointed at it and named, in the simplest possible words, the exact thing that everyone in the lobby had been refusing to say out loud, which was that the shabby man was behaving with more decencies than the entire staff of a grand hotel. The couple by the elevator had turned fully now. One of the guests at the bar had set down a glass. Renee Caldwell's eyes had come up off the counter. Even Andre Boyd, standing there in his uniform with his orders, had shifted his weight in the way a man shifts when something in him has quietly refused to go any further. Keanu Reeves looked down at the child and told her, gently and warmly, that she had done absolutely nothing wrong, not one thing, and that she should not worry, because her mother was going to be found. Tonight, he promised, and then he looked back up at Roland Whitfield, and the look was not angry. It was something older and more settled than anger. And he reached into the pocket of the coat that was now around Lily's shoulders, took out his phone, found a number, and made a call that lasted less than a minute. He said a few quiet sentences. He listened for a moment. He ended the call and put the phone away and rested his hand lightly on the back of Lily's chair and waited. And the waiting had a quality to it that made Whitfield, for the first time that night, uncertain. The elevator chimed. It was a small sound, one the lobby produced dozens of times a night without notes ceasing, but every person in that room noticed this one. The doors opened, and a silver-haired man in a dark suit stepped out. A man who had clearly dressed in a hurry, followed by two others from the executive floor, moving with the contained urgency of people who understand exactly what they are walking into. The silver-haired man was Howard Bennett, the chief executive of the company that operated the Carrington, and every other property in the groups, and he crossed the lobby floor directly to the pair of armchairs in the center. And he did not look at Roland Whitfield, and he did not look at the desk, and he stopped in front of the shabby man in his shirt sleeves with a lost child wrapped in his coat, and he said, with a formality that carried real weight, "Mr. Reeves, I am so sorry. We came down as fast as we could. The lobby did not go silent all at once, the way rooms do in films. It went silent, the way rooms actually do. One sound at a time, a conversation trailing off here, a glass going still there, until there was nothing left but the faint piano from the bar, which had become, suddenly and completely, the wrong music for the moment." Howard Bennett straightened and turned to face the front desk, and when he spoke his voice was even, which made it far worse than if he'd shouted. "This," he said, "is Keanu Reeves. He is the owner of the Carrington. He owns this building. He owns the desk you are standing behind, and the floor you are standing on, and the company that signs the checks that decide whether any of you work here tomorrow morning. And he has spent the last 20 minutes being treated in his own hotel, like a man who does not belong in it, while trying to help a lost child that this staff would not lift a finger for. He let that sit for exactly one breath, and then he said the thing that landed hardest, because it was said quietly and without any heat at all. I want everyone in this lobby to understand what actually happened here tonight. A child came in off the street, cold and lost and looking for her mother. And the only person in this entire building who treated her like she mattered was the one person every one of you decided did not. You looked at a man and a little girl, and you saw a problem to remove. He looked at the same little girl and saw a child who needed help. That is the whole difference. That is the only thing that was ever being tested in this room. And all of you failed it, and he passed it. And he passed it while you were throwing him out the door. Roland Whitfield had gone the color of the marble. He stood in the center of the floor in his pressed midnight suit with the particular stillness of a man whose entire understanding of his situation has just been demolished and who has not yet worked out how to exist inside the new version of it. Trent Dawson had both hands flat on the desk as if he needed it to keep standing. And over by the revolving door, Salsaman Greer, the old doorman, allowed himself, at last, a small and private smile, because he had known for 20 minutes exactly who the shabby man was. And he had been waiting, with the patience of a lifetime of nights, for the rest of the room to catch up. Lily tugged at the sleeve of the shirt of whose coat she was wearing. "Do you own this whole place?" she whispered, looking up at all the marble and the lights as though seeing it for the first time. And Keanu Reeves looked down at her, and something in his face that had been held very still all evening softened completely, and he said, "I do. And right now the most important thing in it is finding your mom." He was as good as his word. The call he had made had set more than one thing in motion, and within 20 minutes a frantic woman named Bridget Sutton, who had spent the most terrifying hour of her life, retracing her steps through a crowded transit hall. And finally, on the advice of a transit officer, calling every hotel and business within a half-mile of the station, was brought through the revolving doors of the Carrington by a police officer. And she crossed that lobby at a dead run. And the sound that came out of her when she saw her daughter, wrapped in a stranger's worn coat in a warm armchair, was the sound of a fear that had been held at full pressure for an hour finally breaking. Lily came out of the chair and into her mother at a speed that knocked the breath out of both of them. And Keanu Reeves stood and stepped back and let the two of them have the moment without him in it. The way you do when the best thing you can be in a scene is no longer part of it. Bridget Sutton had her own hour to carry out of that lobby, and it is worth saying that no part of what came afterward gave it back to her. She had lived through 60 minutes of the specific terror that belongs only to a parent who has lost a child in a crowd. The terror that does not care how the story ends, because while you are inside it, there is no end. There is only the next doorway and the next face that is not your child's face, and she had spent those 60 minutes being told, at more than one bright, official-looking place she had run into off the street, that they could not help her, that this was not that kind of establishment, that she should try somewhere else, the same sentence in a dozen rooms, while her daughter sat cold and hungry, a half-mile away in a lobby that was actively trying to throw her out. When Bridget Sutton finally held Lily again, the fear broke, but the hour did not unhappen. It became a thing she would carry, a new and permanent flinch every time her daughter's hand slipped out of hers in a crowd. That is one of the ways the damage of a night like this outlives the night. The reckoning that followed punished the guilty and promoted the brave and corrected the building. And it could not reach back into that hour and make it not have happened to a mother and a 7-year-old. Some of what is broken on a night like this stays broken even after everything that can be put right is put right. What happened to Roland Whitfield happened the way these things happen, which is not all at once, and not cleanly, and not the way the room expected. Because Roland Whitfield did not crumble. Trent Dawson crumbled, white-faced and stammering. But Whitfield, once the first shock passed, did what men like Whitfield do, which is to begin, immediately and instinctively, to manage the problem. He did not apologize to Keanu Reeves, not really, not in any way that cost him anything. What he said, when Howard Bennett told him his employment was terminated effective immediately, was that there had been a misunderstanding, that he had been acting out of an abundance of caution for the safety of a minor, that a disheveled and unidentified man attaching himself to an unaccompanied child was exactly the kind of situation the staff were trained to treat with suspicion. That he had, if anything, been protecting the little girl, and that he would be speaking to his own attorney about the way he had been humiliated in front of guests and staff. He buttoned his jacket, he straightened his cuffs, and he walked toward the back office with the stiff, intact dignity of a man who has decided that the best defense is to become the hero of his own version of fuss. And Keanu Reeves watched him go and understood, with a cold and complete clarity, that this was not over, because men like Roland Whitfield never simply absorb a loss. They go to work on it. And the work they do is always, in the end, the thing that finishes them. It started the next day, and it started exactly where Keanu Reeves had known it would. Roland Whitfield filed an incident report, not the truthful one, which the night's events would have written by themselves, but a constructed one, dated and signed, in which the shabby unidentified man had been aggressive, had refused lawful instructions, had behaved erratically near an unaccompanied minor, and had been removed by security as a precautionary measure in keeping with the hotel's child safeguarding protocol. It was a careful document. It used the right words. It took the single most damning fact about Whitfield's conduct, that he had endangered a child by refusing to help her, and it turned that fact precisely inside out, recasting the man who had protected Lily as a threat to her, and the man who had endangered her as her protector. It was, in its way, a small masterpiece of the particular craft Roland Whitfield had spent his whole career perfecting, which was the craft of making the record say something other than what had happened. He had always understood, in a way that honest people often do not, that for most of his life the record was the only version of events that survived. The lobby empties, the witnesses go home, the guests check out and forget. What remains, what gets pulled up months later, when a question is asked, is the document, and the document says whatever the person who wrote it needed it to say, and there is usually no one left who cares enough to contradict it. He had removed people before and written them into the wrong, and it had always held, because the people he removed were exactly the people the world was already inclined to believe the worst about. And a report confirming the worst about such a person met no resistance anywhere. He did not understand, even now, even sitting down to write it, that the thing that had always made his reports safe, the absence of anyone with the standing and the will to contradict them, was precisely the thing that no longer applied, because this time the man he had written into the wrong owned the company that kept the records. And to make the document stand, Whitfield needed it corroborated, and so he went to the young clerk, Trent Dawson's, and told him, in the tone of a mentor doing a frightened junior a favor, that the smartest thing Trent could do for his own future was to confirm the report, to remember the evening the way the report described it, because that was the version that protected everyone, and a young man early in his career did not want to be on the wrong side of how this got remembered. And here is where the machine Roland Whitfield was building to save himself became the machine that destroyed him, because a forged story needs every witness to hold. And Whitfield had spent his career being the kind of man for whom no one will hold. Trent Dawson did not sign it. Trent, who had pulled his hand back from the phone, who had spent a sleepless night sick with his own small cowardice, looked at the document Whitfield wanted him to confirm, the document that called a kind man a danger to a child, and found that there was, after all, a floor beneath which he would not go. He took the report, and he took the conversation in which Whitfield had pressured him to confirm it, which he had been frightened of, and wise enough to keep a record of, and he brought all of it to Howard Bennett. The doorman, Solomon Greer, gave a statement of his own, calm and complete, 40 years of credibility behind every line of it, describing exactly what he had seen, and adding, almost as an afterthought, that he had recognized Mr. Reeves the moment he walked in and had watched the entire thing unfold, knowing precisely who was being thrown out of his own hotel. Andre Boyd, the security guard, told the truth about the order he had been given and the reason his own feet had slowed. Renee Caldwell, the concierge who had stood frozen at her desk, found that with the structure of fear removed, she had a great deal to say, and said it. And the lobby cameras and the phones of half a dozen guests held a record that no incident report could rewrite. But it was the forgery itself that did the real damage, because a false report alleging that a man was a danger to a child is not a workplace dispute. It is a documented attempt to destroy an innocent person with the single most serious accusation a person can carry. And once the company's lawyers had that in their hands, the matter stopped being about one bad night and one fired manager. There is a particular weight to that kind of false accusation that Roland Whitfield, in his haste to save himself, had badly underestimated. A rude manager is a complaint. A manager who fabricates a safeguarding record, who puts in writing falsely that an identified man behaved as a danger to a child, has crossed out of the territory of bad service and into the territory of the law, because a document like that does not stay in a drawer. It follows a man. It can end his ability to work, to volunteer, to stand near a school, to live an ordinary life, on the strength of a lie typed by someone who needed a story. The very seriousness that had made the accusation tempting to Whitfield, the way it cast him as a protector and the stranger as a threat, was exactly what made it catastrophic once it was exposed as invented. Because the system that exists to take such accusations seriously also exists. When one is proven fabricated, to take the fabrication seriously. Whitfield had reached for the heaviest weapon in the building to defend himself, and it had gone off in his hand. When investigators began to pull on the thread of the forged report, they did not find a single lapse. They found a pattern. They found that Roland Whitfield had a history, across more than one property in the group, of removing guests he had decided did not fit, and of papering over those removals afterward with incident reports that recast his own conduct as caution and the guests as misbehavior. They found other documents that did not match the footage. They found a regional security supervisor who had been signing off on Whitfield's reports without reading them. A quiet convenience that had let the practice run for years. What had begun as the story of one shabby man and one lost child in one lobby opened, thread by thread, into a review of every property Roland Whitfield had ever touched, and the deeper it went, the worse it looked, and the machine he had built over years to protect himself came apart, the way those machines always do once the light gets into them, all at once after holding for a long time. He was not merely fired. The forged safeguarding report and the pattern it exposed turned a termination into a matter for lawyers, defamation, and the falsification of safeguarding records, and a tangle of related claims, his name attached at last, in documents he could not control, to the conduct he had spent a career making sure was never written down. The regional supervisor who had rubber-stamped him went too. The guests he had quietly removed over the years, some of whom had carried the small, private wound of that night ever since, without ever knowing it had been deliberate, began to surface as the review widened. Howard Bennett did not contest a single one of their claims, because they were true, and because a company whose entire reason for existing was the dignity of the person at the door did not get to act wounded when the bill for its worst employee finally arrived. There was a night, weeks later, when it was all coming down, that Roland Whitfield sat alone and did the thing such men almost never do, which was to see himself plainly, and it did him no good at all, because by then it was far too late. He thought, perhaps for the first time, about the little girl in the thin coat, about the glass of milk, about the worn jacket a stranger had put around her shoulders while Whitfield himself had reached for security instead of a phone. And he understood alone, with nothing left to protect, that the story he had told about protecting a child had been exactly backward, that he had been the danger in that lobby and the shabby man had been the safety, and that he had known it, somewhere, even as he gave the order. He never apologized. Some part of him grasped that an apology now would be one more performance, one more thing done for himself, and the single decent instinct he had left was to spare everyone the theater of his guilt and carry it alone, which was the only thing he ever did that was not about himself. And it came years too late to count for anything. Keanu Reeves took no satisfaction in any of it. He had been the invisible man in too many beautiful lobbies to enjoy watching even a Roland Whitfield go down. He had done only one thing that was a choice rather than a consequence, which was to stay that night, in the chair, with the child, instead of leaving or pulling rank, and everything that followed was simply Roland Whitfield colliding with a truth he could not forge his way out of, a truth Keanu Reeves had not created, only refused to look away from. The other reckonings were quieter, and not all of them were punishments. Trent Dawson kept his job. Keanu Reeves was clear with Howard Bennett that the young man who had, in the end, refused to sign the lie, who had brought the truth forward at real risk to his own young career, was not to be discarded along with the man who had tried to corrupt him. Trent was put into a program, not a skills course, but something closer to an education, a long and deliberate reckoning with what the work was and who it was for. And Keanu Reeves told him, in a brief conversation neither of them ever repeated, that the measure of a person was not whether they ever failed, but what they did in the hour after they understood they had, and that Trent had, in that hour, done the rarest and most important thing, which was to choose correctly when it cost him something. The door, Keanu Reeves said, is open. Walk through it as the person you were last night, after you decided, not the one you were at the desk before you did. It would have been easy, and a lesser man would have done it, to fire Trent Dawson along with Whitfield, because Trent had been there too, had pulled his hand back from the phone too, had been part of the wall of silence that let the thing happen. But Keanu Reeves had spent his life watching the difference between the people who build a cruelty and the people who merely to fail for one frightened moment to stop it. And he believed those were different failures requiring different answers. Whitfield had constructed the thing and then tried to forge his way out of it. Trent had frozen, the way frightened junior people freeze in front of a confident superior. And then, given a clear choice between the easy lie and the costly truth, had chosen the truth. A company that fired both of them equally would teach every junior employee watching exactly the wrong lesson, which was that there is no point in ever coming forward, because the punishment is the same, whether you lie or tell the truth. Keanu Reeves wanted the opposite lesson taught loudly, which was that the hour after you understand you were wrong is the hour that defines you, and that walking through it correctly is seen, and is rewarded, and is the whole of what redemption actually is. Renee Caldwell, the concierge who had stood frozen at her post, was promoted into a supervisory role in guest services. Because, as Keanu Reeves put it to Howard Bennett, the failure in that lobby had not been a failure of her character, but a failure of a structure that had taught a good person that speaking up was not safe. And the cure for that was to put people who knew the difference between right and wrong into positions where they were actually permitted to act on it. She had watched, and she had known, and she had been made mute by the architecture of the place. And the answer was not to punish her for the muteness, but to tear out the architecture. And Solomon Greer, the old doorman, the man who had recognized Keanu Reeves the moment he walked in, was sought out by the owner himself the following week, and the two of them stood together near the revolving door. Late one night, two men who had once carried other people's bags through to the small houses in a hotel that no longer existed. And they talked, for a long time, about the porter who had trained them both. The patient man with the sentence about how you judge a house by the way it treats the people it thinks do not matter, who had died many years ago and was not alive to see either of the boys he had taught, or the hotel that one of them had built on his single sentence, or the night that sentence had been proven true again in a lobby full of marble. Solomon told him a thing that night that Keanu Reeves had not known, which was that the old porter, near the end of his life, had heard that one of his boys had bought a failing hotel and was trying to make something of it, and had said to Solomon that he hoped the boy remembered why, not how. Why? That a man could learn how to run a beautiful building from anyone, but that the why was the only part that was hard to keep, because the why was invisible and the building was not. And a place would always, if you let it, drift towards serving the people who looked like money and away from the people who looked like need, not through any single decision, but through 1,000 small ones made by tired people at midnight. And that the whole work, the entire work, was holding the why in place against that drift. Keanu Reeves stood at the door of the Carrington and listened to a dead man's worry reach him through an old friend, and understood that the worry had been correct, that the place had drifted exactly as the old porter feared, all the way to the point of throwing a lost child and the man helping her out into the cold, and that the night had been, in the end, the drift meeting the why head-on in his own lobby, and the why winning, but only barely, and only because he had happened to walk through the door. It would not always be there to walk through the door. That was the thought that stayed with him. The why could not depend on the owner's accidental presence. It had to be built into the place so deeply that it held on the nights no one important was watching, which were the only nights that had ever counted. Some of the people who should have been there to see a thing made right are not there to see it. That is one of the ways the world stays uneven even after the right thing finally happens. 3 months later, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, a family came through the revolving doors of the Carrington, travel-worn and dressed for comfort rather than for impressing anyone, and Renee Caldwell came across the lobby to meet them before they had even reached the desk, and introduced herself by name, and did not glance at their luggage or their shoes, and asked how she could make their stay easy. Within a few minutes, their shoulders had come down. It was the ordinary work of the place, the everyday version of the thing Keanu Reeves had spent his life trying to build, and it was happening without anyone important watching, which was the only proof that it ever meant anything to him. He was there, in fact, that afternoon, standing in a far corner of the lobby in a plain jacket, having come for a scheduled visit this time rather than a midnight accident. And he watched Renee greet the tired family and did not announce himself, because he wanted to see the thing in its natural state first. He thought about Lily, who was home and safe with her mother, and who had, before she left that night, done something he had not expected. While the grown-ups had been sorting out the last of it, she had sat in the warm armchair with a few sheets of hotel notepaper and a handful of crayons that Renee had quietly found for her. And she had drawn a picture, the way children do, of the whole lobby, the marble and the lights and the piano, and all the people in it, the doorman and the lady from the desk, and the big quiet security man and her mother, and the man who had given her his coat, everyone standing together under the chandeliers. And she had pressed it into Keanu Reeves's hands before she left, folded once, the way you give someone something important, and he had kept it. I keep going back to the drawing, not the call I made, not the moment the elevator opened, not any of the part that looked like power. The folded piece of hotel notepaper, a 7-year-old named Lily drew in crayon, while the grown-ups around her decided what kind of place they were going to be. She drew everyone into it. Whitfield was not in the picture, and I do not think that was an accusation. I think a child simply draws the people who were kind to her, and he had not been one of them, and so he was not there. But everyone else was, the doorman and the concierge and the guard whose feet slowed, and her mother and a tired man in his shirt sleeves, all of them standing together under the lights, as though the lobby in her drawing were the lobby the building had always meant to be, and had failed, for one ugly hour, to actually be. She got cold and lost and hungry in a city full of grand warm rooms that would not take her in, and the one that finally did almost threw her back out into the dark, and she still drew it full of people holding her safe. That is the part I cannot put down. Not that a hotel failed and was corrected. That a child who had every reason to draw a cold and empty room drew a warm and crowded one instead, and handed it to the person most responsible for making the real one match the one in her crayons. I keep it where I will see it. It is the only performance review I have ever fully trusted. While this story is fictional, the lessons about what we owe to the people we have decided do not matter, and especially to a frightened child who cannot prove she belongs, are very real. Thank you for following this story. Let us know in the comments below. If this story has moved you and you'd like to stand with us in bringing more voices of truth and hope to light, please consider supporting our work. Even the smallest gift helps us continue creating and sharing these powerful stories. You can find the donate link in the description. And of course, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter we're preparing for you.